Right, so we can go ahead and begin. So let's see, this is episode 25, I believe, of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So today we're just going to go over some results from stuff we talked about last time, looking at the compensation tiers in particular in order to identify terms that we can look at individually. So let me just share my screen with you here. Yeah, why not? Okay, so the gist of what we were doing, this is just a outline of the current research product, which is focused on text mining. And so we were down here in the kind of combined methods results discussion, and the reason why it's set up like that rather than treating those as discrete units is since we're using sort of different methods, it makes more sense to say, you know, here's what we did, here's what we found, and here's what we think, then move on to the next sort of section, rather than say, you know, here are the ways we looked at the data as a whole through frequency, and then here's what we did to look at the tiers, and now, you know, what we did, look at the words, and now let's move on to the results of each. It doesn't make sense to structure it that way. It makes sense to structure them vertically, you know, so here's how we looked at frequency, what we found, what we think that means. Here's how we looked at categorizing the work into tiers. Here's how we did that, what we found and what we think that means, and now we have some results about that. And then lastly, here's how we looked at individual terms which popped out of the previous examinations, and here's what we found there. That's the gist. So we've already sort of gone through the overview, looking at frequency data, clustering and topic modeling, and then potentially looking at the data as a whole through the LDA viz, which is that, as you'll remember, that cluster diagram that shows us how terms can be grouped together, and, you know, allows us to dig into that data visually. So turning to the compensation tiers here, we'd already prepped, you know, we have the 5 compensation tiers, and we'd prepped the keenness measurements and the Tf-Idf measurements. So again, these are just sort of 2 different ways to figure out what's going on in those tiers, right? We have the measurements themselves here broken into the tiers for both keenness and Tf-Idf. We also then have the keenness diagram, which can be helpful because it shows you the head and the tail, right? By the by, I also updated this diagram. All I did was I moved the pages in it around, because previously the pages went by unigrams, bigrams, trigrams. But if you look at the measurements, they're broken into the tiers, and it makes sense to think about the tiers as tiers.
Yeah.
So I shifted around the pages in this the diagram here, which is actually 30 diagrams, because it's 5 tiers, and then there are 6 within each, because you've got as we can see here, let's see, this is 0. So this is unigrams 0. Then you've got the expanded version of unigrams 0. Then you've got bigrams 0. So you've got unigrams, bigrams, trigrams. Looking at the data just flat, right? So just treating each hit equally, and then expanded. So that's 6 per tier, right? Unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, regular and expanded. So that's 6, right? 3 times 2. And then there's 5 tiers. So now these diagrams match that structure.
Nice.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that makes sense. I think even when I printed them out, I think I put them in that order anyway.
Well, since we're breaking them into tiers, it makes sense to look at them in tiers. It doesn't make sense to look at them as unigrams, bigrams, trigrams. So this now matches that. When you look at this online, it's just the pages, and so it's not quite as useful because it's not clear. In fact, this came up last time. It's not clear exactly what you're looking at right here, right? You kind of have to triangulate. Oh, okay, well, I know this is 0 because it has here on the y-axis, it has the key, right? And I know this is the flat, or the standard, rather than the expanded one where you do proportionally by hits, just by the numbers, right? This goes up to 75,000. This goes up to 6e plus 0.6, which is notation for a much bigger number. But if you download this, each one of these has a bookmark, right? These are PDFs. So if you download this file and look at the bookmarks, it's actually a lot more intelligible. I didn't do that in advance, but I assure you it is the case. Let's see here. That's probably it. And let me look at the, oops. Let's see. I guess, yeah, it's table of contents on the Mac side, because they have a separate thing to store bookmarks. On the Windows, using Acrobat Reader, I should say. Acrobat Reader calls these bookmarks. Preview on the Mac side calls it the table of contents. But you can see here, this says unigram 0 keyness, right? This says unigram expanded 0 keyness. So it's much more useful if you actually look at this offline rather than online, because ideally what would happen is each one of these would have a title, but I didn't put that in when I made these, and I'm not going back to fix that.
It's too late. It's too late now.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I'm not doing that. No, I've done enough cleaning. Anywho, so what I did was I just sort of systematically went through these, right? So I started with the diagrams and then used the measures, because the measures are the diagrams. Like, so if we look at 0 keyness here, it's the same stuff. It's just that the diagram gives you this helpful head and tail, right?
Yeah.
So, we can see the top and the bottom here. And in fact, what's kind of interesting is in cases where there are straight up ties, sometimes it's the same information, but the way that they appear on the diagram, particularly the tail. So like if we look here, well, these don't have ties, well, now. But in places where these numbers are tied, sometimes the order is slightly different, because if they're tied numerically, their presentation is somewhat arbitrary, right?
I see.
So like if these last 3, survey, minute, and study, were tied numerically here, which they aren't, but if they were, it might present them in a different order, but they'd all be there.
Yeah.
It's just a small quirk. But anywho, the data is the same here, right? So survey, minute, study, complete, compensation, right? We can see that's the same thing here in the tail. This just gives you a little bit of a more thorough view, because it ranks all the way from 1 to the end, in this case, over 8,000, because we're talking about unigrams. But it also, in some places when you're dealing with trigrams, I noticed, or even here, like with a bigram, there's a little bit of clipping, you may have noticed.
Mm-hmm.
So like this says Komodo product, and probably that's product, but it's clipped. And if you shift to trigrams here, here's a good example, right? These are clipped, right? So you can see the it's clipping these things off. So it's useful. And again, that's something probably I should have fixed, but didn't. In part because the information is here.
So, yeah, we can just cross, just double check it against this.
Right.
Sheet.
So let's see, we want trigrams 0. Is this expanded? It is. Wait, what am I looking at here? Oh no. It was not expanded. So it's this one, right? That has, yeah. Oh, and here's an example, right? So these two are tied. And so the diagram lists that as product class and Komodo. If you look at it here, it's actually in the other order because these are technically tied. I just wanted to bring that up because you can look and say, wait, why aren't these exactly the same? It's because when they're numerically tied, their arrangement is arbitrary. But you can see it's the same stuff, and then it moves on to hit type 4, and then these must be tied. Yep, these are all 43s. So their arrangement is arbitrary, but you can see that, right? I mean, because these are at the same level in the bars, right? Yeah. Anywho, so yes, the information is here, and it just does require, it's like, well, if you look at this and these are trigrams, it's like, well, what does this actually say? It's important because a whole word, a whole feature, a term is getting cut off. And so you do need to cross-reference. Anywho, so that's what I did, is I just went through these systematically. And I tried to, because, you know, when you try and get your arms around this data, it's sort of like, well, what do I do? I mean, do I just kind of stab in here? And I mean, the diagrams are helpful because they cut off, right? I mean, this gives us what? I think it's like 20 features, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, it's got to be like 20 features.
Yeah.
And so it gives you sort of a thumbnail of the head and the tail, which is useful. And so that's what I kind of did, is I was like, well, let me approach this systematically and just go through the keenness diagrams and then cross-reference with the measures and see what's happening there. And you can kind of get a sense of the overall nature of the tier if you look at things like, well, this is the this is trigrams, it's not expanded, yeah, for 0, the 0 category, right? And you kind of get a sense of, okay, so both of these are product classification. Here we start seeing issues of brands, right? So you can kind of get an overall sense of what's going on there. And that's what I did, is I just went through, you can see here, I just kind of wrote up preliminary findings. I started by going through tiers because that's what made sense. And then I looked at the keenness measurements for each tier. And then I broke it down into how we looked at them, right? Unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, unexpanded, and then expanded. It looks a little bit weird here in Markdown because Markdown understands underscores to indicate italics. And these are actually just, file names, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what I did, is I broke them down, and then I looked at their Tf-Idf measurements. So Tf-Idf, as we know, it's just another way of looking at the information. And you'll notice, and it's broken up the same way. So we look at 0, it again goes through unigrams, unexpanded, and then expanded, bigrams, trigrams. So it's the same setup, and that's why I made the diagram fit this. And so, like, if we look, here's, let's go to the same one. I think it was trigram 0, not expanded. You can see there's some similarity there, right? So the first two are this product classification service, Komodo product classification. What's that?
Still a tie.
Yeah, and it's an exact tie, probably because they're in the same hit. I mean, that's what it's showing us there, is it's the same hit. And then Tf-Idf, sometimes you get a little bit more what I consider to be noise, where you're looking at, like, this is the, right?
Yeah.
It's in part because when you do bigrams and trigrams, you can't really, or you have to make a choice about whether to include stop words or not, right? And the default, and it's what we followed, is to include stop words, because otherwise you're forming bigrams and trigrams that are not there in the data.
Right.
Right, because you could have significant word, preposition, significant word, and if you pull out that preposition, you're smashing together two words that aren't really put together.
Yeah, and given our, and as I think we discussed several episodes back, those prepositions might be important for us because they're suggesting a particular relationship.
Relationship. Yep.
Yeah.
So, so we left them in. It not only sort of makes sense in terms of looking at the data, but also it does things like if you want to look up, and that's the other thing is when you're looking at these and you see these terms, it's like, what is it talking about here? And really the only thing you can do is go to the data and search for these things together. It's like if I wanted to find what is brand pair audit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I have to go to the data. See if, brand pair audit. Yeah, I think it found one there. Sorry, I'm gonna get too many windows while I'm trying to share screens. Yeah, so like this is the hit type for item brand pair audit, right? To even look things up,
Yeah.
you have to, you have to know if you cut out stop words, it would be like you can't do it. You can't go to the data. Anywho, so that's what's going on there. And so I just went through these and I just looked at them, right?
Yeah.
And I worked up some of this stuff into these. This is our document for preliminary data findings. And I added some stuff here to categorizing data and then some stuff here to key terms pairs, which is what we were doing. We wanted to find those key terms or paired words like transcribing and summarizing. Although now I'm not exactly certain that's the best binary. But that way, for the next step now, we can look at those individual concepts and see like, what are their partners in crime? I mean, like, as we'll look at here in a bit, if you see a word that's significant, it's like, well, what does that connect to? What is it frequently with, right?
Right.
How is its posse different from the posse of another term, right? So here in categorizing data, some of this stuff we'd already kind of noticed, like one thing that wasn't necessarily a surprise, but is interesting, and it does appear in the data. That's one thing is, you have particularly now since I've seen this data so many times, it's like you get an intuitive sense of what's going to be there, but you want to make sure that that's borne out in the findings, right? It's not just, well, here's what I think. It's okay, well, here's what's actually manifesting. So one thing is the sort of frequent appearance of mental health related topics.
Yeah.
That just, it is there in the data based on our methods. So that's something is that humans are, and this is potentially a differentiating point, they experience particular types of trauma.
Right.
And this manifested in a lot of ways. One of the common ones is Hurricane Harvey, a term or a feature that just kept popping up quite a bit, is this notion of talking to people generally through surveys or questionnaires and asking them to reflect on these kind of traumatic experiences. One notable one was Hurricane Harvey, but we also saw a lot of other terms pop up related to this plexus, like mental health, well-being, or just well-be. That's the stem. Vet or veteran, cancer, coping, right? That all often came up, cope or coping.
Yeah.
That almost exclusively, if you do a find in the hits themselves for cope or coping, it's a little tough to search for the stem cop, because then you start to get other things. But anywho, if you search for that, it's almost always related to mental health issues, coping with this or that. So that's something that emerges is, humans defined by trauma, right?
Right.
And it's just kind of interesting because it's like, if we're looking for these ways that you can manifest differences between the human and the non, it goes back to what we talked with Amy Evans from IRB about, humans are risk entities.
Yeah, that's IRB's definition of it. The way its technique parses the human is a subject at risk.
Mhm.
And if you're not at risk, IRB doesn't consider you human.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that came up again, sort of. I think it was with Jim Brown, where we were talking about IRB weirdness.
Yeah.
And how I think he had kind of a, I don't know, and so but maybe like a little bit of a unusual IRB experience where one or more board members saw things like tweets as putting entities at risk because you could de-identify. I mean, it's like, even though a Twitter account can be not attached to your physical person, if you quote a tweet, you could search and therefore de-anonymize, right, who provided that tweet, right? It could be traced to an account, even though you could not then take the further step of saying, yeah, but who's the human behind that account?
Right.
But I mean, it sort of speaks to the notion of risk and how it manifests differently, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he sort of, and my, position on that is, well, but that's in the public space, and the risk is minimal. And also, if your position is you can search a tweet and therefore find the person, and that's a risk, you have now removed the ability to do any sort of internet research. That's what you've done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because,
the implications of that are pretty stunning.
yeah, I mean, it undermines. That means you literally could not do any form of internet research, because you're putting all publications, anything that's on the internet is findable. Therefore, unless it's on the dark web, anyway.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore, it can be attributed to some entity, and therefore that puts them at risk. It's like, okay, well, then the internet is now completely off limits to research. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
But anyway, within this, and we talked with Amy Evans about, is what we're doing, do we need to submit that for IRB approval? And her, and I think the mainline IRB position was no, particularly because, and this is, you'll notice, our public version of our data, because we have a version that does connect this with entities. And some of those entities are people's real names, right? And so in that case, her position was, that's a little stickier. So she's like, these things that are public, I don't think you'd need to go through IRB, but you should take the step of anonymizing that data by when you share this stuff, which we're doing, don't have that column for the requester, right? And our position was, well, we don't really need to share the requester with people. And anytime we aggregate that and say, well, this requester is doing it, we can just sort of anonymize that and say, requester one or whatever. However, it turns out that the requester has not so far really been that significant for us. The only time we really talk about it is when we say some of these terms manifest in like the same hit. Like, it seems like it's prevalent. If you just look at frequencies, it seems like this term is frequent, but then it turns out it's one hit. It just has 50,000 available hits associated with it, Anywho, so that's one finding that kind of came out of looking at these things in tiers, is some of these tiers, these kind of trauma or risk concerns are very prevalent, right?
And I'm trying to think, what compensation levels were those? Tell us about your trauma. How many pennies do they get a hit?
Right. So that's one thing we can see is, where does that come up? And like, if we look at 0 here, and I did sort of brief write-ups at the end, but they're not really, like, let's see, do any of them?
Some of them were in the middle 60s.
Yes. So like middle 60, you're right. Middle 60, if you look at both the keenness and the Tf-Idfs, the write-up here says there's lots of mental health trauma, like Hurricane Harvey. in opposition to, and see, that's the useful thing about the keenness measurements, is it not only gives you what's prevalent, but it gives you the tail.
Yeah.
So when we say in the middle 60 that mental health and risk things are prevalent, it puts them in opposition to things like receipt extraction, which, boy, that's super prevalent.
Yeah.
Pulling information out of receipts, marketing research surveys, online searching, which is like finding ISN codes, or this had things like finding email addresses. So it's a lot of like Google searching.
Yeah.
There's this whole cadre of hits that are, I started to call it scut work, which was either stuff like, hey, we need some, it's data entry, but it's like, we need you to find all the email addresses associated with people on this list or something like that, you know?
Yeah, some of them, yeah. And I think what wasn't one even like type in these two search terms and then list the autofill, like what
Yeah.
does Google, you know? Although one thing I noticed as I'm looking at now, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the mental coping thing showed up in the middle 60 not weighted, but when you weight it, the middle 60, they sort of go away.
Let's see. Well, so it depends. Yes. If we look at the middle 60 here,
Yeah.
we can see unweighted, yes, these kind of risk things come up. When you weight them, what's interesting is the prevalent thing is finding those object boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that I put into a different category than scut work, because there's a difference, I think. This is what it helped me see between we need some information, and it's just easier to have humans go get it, right? So yeah, autofill. It's just easier to pay humans some pennies to go through a list of terms and say what's the autocomplete than to set up a machine to do that. But we want the information. I want the email addresses. When you get to this category of stuff like finding object boundaries, there is this, if you actually look at the hits, a lot of times it really seems like it's training a machine learning algorithm.
Yeah.
It doesn't really care where the cat, if you get an image and it says point out all the cats and trace what a cat is in this,
Yeah.
we don't really want the information. We know what the cat is. We want the
Right.
process, right? So it's a little bit of a different job than we need some information. It's easier for you to go get it. It's we want you to do this so that we can train a machine learning algorithm.
Yeah.
There are these weird, interesting ones, and we talked about this previously, where it's almost kind of both, maybe, where it was put boundaries around these structures and then make a determination about how damaged the structure is.
Yeah. I feel like this is like an insurance company sort of kind of work.
It seemed like, again, it was probably machine learning algorithm training, because it wants to make an automated means to,
Right.
look at the picture and have a machine say, okay, well, here's the house and here's how damaged that house is based on people's ratings. Because I mean, that's how machine learning works. You give it 500,000, this is the house, and people say this is sort of damaged, this is really damaged, this is a total wreck.
Yeah.
And machine learning,
Yeah, just training a bot to recognize how dinged up dude's car is.
yes, yeah, and I mean that's core machine learning. Is here's 50,000 faces that people say are sort of handsome, really attractive, and I don't know, whatever and nearly perfect model level, gorgeous. And then new ones, just you feed it that much and it says, okay, well, I sort of get the gist of what a sort of attractive, right? I mean, that's core machine learning stuff. Is you feed it a whole lot of stuff that people have ranked or whatever, and then it gets a sense of that, right?
Yeah.
So in the middle 60, if we don't weight them, we see a lot of mental health risk stuff. If we weight them, we start to see, and this cuts across unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, it starts to show primarily this finding object boundaries. And then some of these, you'll notice I put in bold because they were kind of unique to tiers.
I'd not seen those.
There was this whole thing about, we're going to give you some how-to questions and we want you to rewrite them. And that popped up in the data itself. It wasn't me fishing for that. And it's really only here. And it's interesting because it asks for this synthesis task
Yeah.
that is, you know, in a certain frame, sophisticated, right? Asking people to rewrite how-to questions, you need people to do that. Or this other thing popped up here about describing TV show clips.
Yeah.
That was something that did pop up here. Let me see, where did that appear?
It's scroll down. It was object bound describing. Yeah.
So that popped up mostly in TDF or Tf-Idf. It wasn't as, in fact, I don't think it popped up if you're looking at keenness measurements.
I've been mostly looking at the keenness ones, and I have not seen that one.
Well, see, and the way I proceeded is I looked at keenness first, and then I looked at Tf-Idf. And so a lot of times what I was doing when looking at Tf-Idf, just sort of by the way I proceeded, was confirming, okay, this is what I was seeing in keenness. And sure enough, when you look at Tf-Idf, those same things are popping up. And then noticing when things didn't, right? So Tf-Idf, you start to see literally, like in the bigrams, TV show as a bigram. And so it's like, well, what's that? And then if you just do a find in the data, it takes you to these hits that are like, we're going to show you 35 seconds of a TV show clip, and we want you to describe what you're seeing. And that, again, I mean, it's like, that feels like a human task, you know? Right. And so this is a case where having the Tf-Idf helped identify these things that it's like, oh, it's a, and that kind of task itself, it's like, I'm not exactly sure if that falls more into what I was calling scut work. Does someone really want the description?
Right. Or are they training it, or is someone at TV Guide tired of doing this?
Yeah. And in a lot of cases, it could be both, because a lot of times when you're training machine learning algorithms, you both want the information, but it's because you're going to operationalize it.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, what's your primary goal here? And that's a little tough to ascertain, but it's like, is your primary goal here to have that, not because I need an understanding of what's happening in these 35 seconds of the TV show Castle, which for whatever reason popped up a lot.
It's a complicated show, man.
Yeah. But I mean, or is it I primarily want that so, as you say, I can train something, versus, look, I just need this list of email addresses.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I wonder too, because that, I mean, I just that kind of work is oftentimes like those TV show descriptions. I just know this for several reasons, that's kind of right. If people move out to Los Angeles to become actors, and before, you know, that's the kind of first kind of job they get when they get into the industry, is they work for some production company and they write up.
They're cataloging.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder if someone's seen that as a opportunity for automation.
Yeah. And, you know, for some of this, we have to be careful about making those kinds of connections.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, we can turn to the hits themselves, because a lot of cases, you know, we're looking at these features, unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, and it's like, what's going on there? And you have to look at the hits and say, oh, okay, now this makes a little bit more sense once it's in context, because otherwise, you know, it is a little, there's a lot of things that could be grafted onto a trigram, you know? But anyway, other things that were popping out is, and we talked about this last time, image quality may be a useful thing to look at in terms of compensation, because, man, are there a lot of hits in here about reading, readability, particularly receipt readability.
Yeah, like they got a bunch of shitty copies of some receipts, and they need, you know, the specific sensor of the human eye to make sense of them.
Well, and that seemed like a pretty squarely scut work job, where it's like, no, we want what's on the receipt.
Yeah.
I mean, it could potentially be useful for training, but the hits themselves seem to at least be leaning towards, no, we want to know what it says here.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that is is, I mean, I think it is one of our sort of larger interests is in terms of mechanical Turks and the way that it's parsing the human, that the kind of sort of more what you would see as sort of traditional humanist kind of understandings of the human, right? This talk about your feelings
Yeah.
is just as valuable as, no, I need you this the specific, you know, I
Mhm.
need also your eyes to look at these receipts.
Yeah.
So in that sense, right, a certain kind of um I don't know, biological, right? That they need the human being as a sensor, not as a kind of fully robust human experience. Like, no, I need your eyes because they do things that I can't get my scanner to do.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
basically, I need you as a more advanced scanner, not as a, you know, human.
yeah,
In
a good
that,
example of this is, things like character recognition. Humans are fantastic at doing things like, we know that this is a letter E in whatever font you put that in, right?
right?
Whatever font you want to put that in, we know that's an E. That's not trivial for machines, right? Where it's like, well, that script font doesn't look like this sans serif, 4 lines,
Right.
and humans can do it, that's just something that's super trivial, but not trivial for machines. They've gotten much, much better,
Yeah.
but it is something they have to learn. Whereas for us, it's something that becomes so, it's not innate, but it's so practiced, it just doesn't require the kind of labor. So yes, I mean, our sensory data, and I mean, this comes up in a lot of ways, is just a lot more attuned to certain things that we value. I mean, I'd quail at saying we have a better this or that. The way we kind of conveniently say, well, dogs can smell better than us. It's like, I know what you mean there, but better
Right.
is interested.
Yeah.
What you mean by better?
Yeah. I can look at your face and know that you're Jeremy. I don't need to smell your excrement.
Right.
In that sense, it's not better. I don't, that dog is needs that sense of smell to be a dog. I don't need, in that sense. Also, I can use a dog to follow someone's scent. So in that sense, I can just make the dog a part of my cognitive network. And I actually do smell as good as a dog.
Right.
Because I can use, I mean, it's right when I ask my students, what's the fastest animal on the planet?
Right.
And they say a cheetah. And I'm like, we've escaped Earth's gravity.
Yeah.
Like a cheetah can't get to the moon, no matter how fast it runs. I
And
can go 60 miles an hour without breaking a sweat.
it's relevant, to consider things beyond what Clark calls the skin bag.
Yeah.
As part of our as part of what we are, right? As part of our definitional, human. Because then, as Clark points out, if you just say, well, humans without any kind of, in kind of a platonic sense,
Right.
humans without their technologies, it's like, well, that, how are you? Because language itself is a technology. Does that mean it has to be the human without language? And in that case, do you mean a human without thought? Because it's not clear if you can think in a non-lingual way, right? At least not ways
Maybe
we
like sitting birds. I want to understand birds, but without their nests and all that shit.
or birds without air resistance. I mean, they fly, which
Right.
they couldn't do in a frictionless environment. So I mean, what are you talking about here, right? So
the wings don't get you flight.
right.
Themselves.
Right. The world is necessary. So anywho,
Take that, birds.
put them in their place. One thing also that popped up for me, I'm not even sure if this is a finding just so much as a procedural thing. For one thing, there's a similarity in terms of what you see when you look at bigrams and trigrams. And honestly, bigrams and trigrams tend to be more useful than unigrams. Unigrams, you get such a scatter because we're just talking about a term.
And I've noticed that the unigrams are just, and I think as you're noticing out too, that they're just, the unigrams aren't getting us, what the unigrams are just getting us are truncated bigrams and trigrams. That we're not seeing anything different with unigrams. We're just seeing with the unigram less of a bigram or a trigram, but nothing unique, I think, is popping out at the level of the unigram.
Well, and the unigrams can map to so many potential partners there. It's, you kind of understand context a little bit better when you look at bigrams and trigrams. And, I think partially what we're doing here is reinventing the wheel, because as I've poked into methods here, there are arguments for things like, bigrams and trigrams, weighted bigrams and trigrams are as good as more sophisticated methods of, clustering and, other sorts of measurements
Yeah.
in terms of what's going on in the data. There are arguments that just look at bigrams and trigrams because that's going to tell you as much as sort of hyper sophisticated new methods of classifying or categorizing themes or topics or whatever. Like I was looking at comparisons, this is what topic modeling shows you. Here's what bigrams show you. And it's very close. And it's like, why are we bothering with fuzzy, sophisticated things when just straight up bigrams, trigrams, n-grams show you as good a picture. Anywho. And then as we've been talking about, I was noticing these patterns, right? And this is not a great parsing, but it's just things that pop up is what I was calling scut work, right? Someone needs some information. So extracting information from readable receipts, searching online for data collection purposes. So, there's this whole cadre of ISIN, which are stock codes. And, there's like a lot of these where it's like, I want you to look up the ISIN for this list of businesses, or, or in a more sophisticated way, every real estate broker in this California, in this city. So you need to find, a listing of real estate agents and then find their ISIN, right? These stock codes, right? But someone needs that information, right? I want you to go get me all these ISIN. That to me was sort of like the archetype of, it's not primarily to train an automated system. It's, I just want this, go get it, Then, as I put seemingly a different class of seemingly training machine learning algorithms through human sensory capabilities. So what they want is to train the process, right? We don't really care where the cat is in these pictures. We just want to make it so that this machine knows what cats are.
Right.
Or, a more kind of grounded example is the structures, right? In this picture, put a circle around everything that's a house and then say how damaged that house is, right?
Yeah.
And then there was another category of getting information about human stuff. And this is where like mental health and trauma, because a lot of that, is answer this survey about your coping strategies. And it's different from these other two because what we want is information about people. So it's something that it doesn't, it sort of sets the line between human and non, because you're never really probably going to be able to ask a machine, what's it like to have cancer, and get the same kind of answer that you would from a human. I mean, I can imagine training a machine to give a realistic cancer narrative, but that's not what we want. We want to know from people cancer narratives.
Well, that's
not a simulacrum.
What's really compelling there too is it's still a kind of sensing work, right? And it turns out human beings are the perfect sensor for other human beings, right? That from the standpoint of mechanical Turks, what makes you human is you're really good at assessing other humans, which is a kind of weird, right? I mean, there's lots of interesting sort of, and with that, not the risk of becoming like an evolutionary psychologist, but right, one of the things that appears to have been a selection pressure for human beings is other human beings, right? That one of the, like, why do human beings, like what human beings have developed, the intelligence they've developed to deal with each other, because on a day-to-day basis, the most complicated part of a human being's environment are other human beings. Yeah. So in that sense, right? So we need a human being to tell us about humans, because you are quote, tailor-made to do that, right? Yes. You're really good at sensing each other.
Yep.
And we can all and so that's what you're good for, right? So from Mechanical Turk's perspective, I don't need you because you're a human. I need you because you're a really good sensor array for collecting data about other humans.
Yeah, I mean, as a way to think of it as it's like a weather station. You want to know about the weather? Ask a weather station. You want to know about humans? Ask a human, right? I
Right.
mean, they're very sophisticated sensors for this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So there were things that came out about mental health and trauma. Surveys and questionnaires, particularly marketing research, comes up here a lot. And there are some, if we look at like my write-ups about the tiers, there are some that are interesting kind of cusp cases. What's that? A unigram 0. About finding like brands in banner ads. There are a whole lot of hits that say, look at this banner ad and identify the brand. And I was like, huh, I'm not quite clear where that falls. Like, I mean, what are they doing there? I don't think they're training a machine learning algorithm to identify what brand, or like, I mean, is this market research? It's like, can you readily tell that this is a Coke ad?
I think what potentially is throwing us there is because it's in the 0 tier.
Yeah.
There's some of the other brand stuff we see at a much higher tier because it's more in the lines of the trauma stuff, right? We want to know what you feel about this brand. But then there's this whole other category of brand stuff that's showing up at the 0 tier. And so I think that's in part I think mostly, typically, if we're seeing the phrase brand, we're seeing it either here at the 0 or right in the top 20%.
Right.
So it's at both ends of the compensation spectrum.
Well, and so you wonder, are the 0 ones like qualifiers for these jobs? And in the language, and so when I looked it up, and you can just, look, in fact, we can probably just straight up do it. What you do is you just look in the data. So like, I don't know, banner ad, and then you just check and see what's the compensation for that. So, this one says, right, identify the brands featured in banner ads, type the brand ad found in a series of banner ads, and let's look at the reward. It's 0.6. So that's actually really good. That's really high. So then if we look, keep having to move all these things around. There's a whole nest of them here. If we look at ones that are banner ad but have a 0 compensation, most of them, and I might have to go to a different, like this tier doesn't talk about pre-screening or it being preliminary jobs. Like if we look at the 0 tier as a whole, there isn't a whole lot of talk about these being qualifiers.
Yeah, which I think we potentially expected, right? Do this one for free, and then that gives you access to more lucrative hits.
Well, and like in the penny tier, you do see language about pre-screening questions. Yeah. And you're like, oh, okay, there's that. So it's not quite clear what's going on there at the 0 level or in those banner ad things, because it is high compensated and it's not compensated. And yet those non-compensated ones don't always say, by the by, this is a pre-screener. I mean, you don't know if it's like, we don't know. It's hard to say exactly what's happening there.
Yeah, I think that was probably, maybe understanding that will be in the second wave when we get more into the Turkers. Like, I'm really interested to see how Turkers see the difference between those penny compensation and 0 compensations. And it may be that we talk to Turkers and they're like, oh no, only bots do the 0 compensation. I mean, I don't know. It's although that description of the type in that seems directed at a person.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very much like a high compensation one.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, that can't. Let me go back.
Although I wonder too if we'd have to. I wonder what in part 2. This is only knowing it from the description. What I'm assuming that if someone takes that hit, they get a bunch of images of banner ads. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if those banner ads have words in them, or they're just logos, or, we'd have to, without knowing that too, it's also what You know,
what that job is.
what kinds of banner ads are they wanting me to describe or to type up?
Yeah. So that, and then this one, which is kind of what we would expect, ascertaining the emotional resonance of something. And that was high compensation, where we saw Brave New World. So the terms that popped out there were
Yeah.
sentiment, right? Because they described it as sentiment analysis and mood. There was a whole tranche of high compensation jobs that said, like, look at this image, describe what you see, and identify the mood of it.
Yeah.
And that again feels very human-y, right? And in fact, here where I was writing up key terms and pairs, in looking at this, that's part of why we were doing this, is to find words to examine. Mood and sentiment popped out as, what's going on there. This one also, like rewrite. That's a kind of a shadow term that it's like, oh, rewriting is a human-y term. You didn't see a lot of ones that are asking machines to rewrite. That's something that humans kind of do. I mean,
Right.
And I saw this a lot in context with rewrite these how-to questions. I was like, wow, that's an interesting cognitive task,
Yeah.
Then of course, words like feel, feelings, emotions, and then also opinion. That's another thing. You don't ask machines for their opinion.
Right.
You ask humans for their opinions. And then, as we already identified, brand and product, those are important in some way, but it's not exactly clear precisely how. It does cast humans as consumers, which is something that is human-y, right? We consume.
Yeah.
I mean, everything, in a sense, just about everything consumes, but our consumption habits are maybe characteristic, right? A fire consumes wood, a dog consumes food, a machine consumes electricity. We buy shit.
Right.
So
the buying shit seems important.
Well, and even the term consumption itself. I mean, right? In the four ways I just used it, the three of them are similar. One of them is different, right? Because I'm not buying that stuff to burn, to eat necessarily. It's to possess. Anyway,
just to fill the hole inside you.
What's that?
Just to fill the hole inside of you.
Well, it is interesting that a lot of times when we talk about consume in these ways, it is to possess rather than to use, right? I mean, a fire consumes wood to go through it, food to go through it, but I want this stuff to have, right?
Yeah.
That's a different notion of consumption. And then also, so humans are consumers with feelings about marketplaces. That's another thing that popped up in interesting ways was the term secondhand popped up in, I think it was the middle. Let me see if I can just find it.
Now, was this in the TDIF or Tf-Idf?
Yes, Tf-Idf, stuff about interest. Let's see, and which one is this? It's Penny tier, Tf-Idf, stuff about interest in secondhand marketplaces. And curiously, if you look at these, let me see if I can find, see if it's hyphenated or not. Yeah, will you be interested in the product when searching on a secondhand marketplace? Right? Suppose you're looking for something when doing online shopping at a secondhand marketplace. So it's like, oh, okay, let's look at another one.
So would that be like, I like this on Amazon, but I wouldn't buy it on.
So that's an interesting question.
I would buy this at a grocery store, but I wouldn't buy it from a street vendor or something. I mean, is it something like?
That's an interesting question, because if you look at this, look where it appears.
Yeah.
You see what I'm looking at right here?
Yeah.
A lot of these are foreign language that then, like if we say here, it's basically the same kind of English, but then it also appears with foreign characters, with Chinese characters in particular. But yes, so I mean, we may be able to graft on some question about, is this asking about, would you buy it from a source that is secondhand, or one that is what we sometimes call a knockoff, right?
Right.
Let's look at that. If you are shopping at a secondhand marketplace, would the product be relevant to what you search for? So this seems to be asking, if you're on a secondhand marketplace and you search for this, are you getting relevant search results?
Yeah.
So here the presumption is you're already at the secondhand marketplace, right?
Right.
It's not quite, would you buy this handbag from a used vendor?
Oh, I see.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, even the notion of what constitutes, because, secondhand means previously owned. That's different than this is newly made, but it's
You're getting it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's a off-brand,
Right. Because for some reason I went straight to when you're on Amazon and you can get it prime from Amazon or through Amazon from a third party, and every once in a while, like, I'd rather. You never know.
Well, but that speaks to this notion of kind of brand trust that is weirdly human. The notion of secondhand itself is weirdly human. I mean, secondhand is
Yeah.
a kind of interesting term.
And it's still related. I mean, I feel it's still in that kind of brand product orbit.
Yes.
Like, what is the brand of secondhand as a brand?
Right. I mean, I just had students who were looking at, gosh, I can't remember the language they used, but it had to do with like, it's the opposite of fast fashion.
Yeah.
So, fast fashion is this kind of pejorative of when we make clothes, it's very, it's not only ecologically damaging, but it's wasteful. You wear a t-shirt, you get rid of a t-shirt, it gets pumped into this market of, well, we're just going to dump everything on the third world. And so they have all these, they don't need, there are these articles about the third world doesn't need your damn t-shirts anymore.
Right.
It's just become a garbage can.
Or
And so the opposite of this is, sort of like high fashion, but it's sort of like, a Netflix notion of fashion where I'm going to wear this for a little bit and then someone else is going to wear it for a little bit. Anywho, so that notion of, clothing in the secondhand markets that emerge around there. But, secondhand is itself kind of an interesting term to what it applies because, as you point out, it's like, there are secondhand handbags, but there isn't exactly like secondhand food.
Right.
And so where's the dividing line between, vintage and nasty? And, I mean, it's Seinfeld, of course, has a bit about that vintage clothing, or as I call it, nasty wear, right?
Yeah.
And there is no vintage underwear. I mean, there is, but that's a different, that's a tangent.
Right. And you see the kind of branding around, there's now a, I keep seeing ad that keep popping up on Hulu, but an ad for basically a secondhand high fashion. But the ad is really interestingly structured in the way in which it's trying to have both, right? It's trying to play up the kind of ethic of secondhand.
Mm-hmm.
So people who normally might not get high fashion can get it if it's got some kind of ecological bent to it. Kind of interesting, right? That you're anyway. But yeah, all to say that there's lots of I could see this kind of the niche for this kind of market research.
Or if you're, a podcast listener, you've probably encountered the Real Reel, which is
I think this is what I'm talking about. Yeah, this is actually this is what I'm talking about.
The Real Reel. Yeah, I mean, they're sort of the flagship of this kind of market where it's, it's trying to deal with these ecological issues, but also, lo and behold, trying to deal with the entry issues of high fashion, right? Affordability, that kind of thing. And also, as its name implies, dealing with knockoffs, right? It's called Real Real because the idea is you can trust that these aren't knockoffs, which to me was always such an interesting thing because it's like, if you can't tell, what difference does it make?
Right.
If no one is able to tell the difference between the real and the unreal real, why is it a significant difference?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too is it's using its second-handedness to affirm its authenticity.
Yeah.
Because you're getting it secondhand, that for some reason that's a that's a guarantee of authenticity.
Right. Yeah, there's no secondhand knockoff market. You just buy the knockoff.
Because I guess the assumption being is whoever's buying the knockoff purse is not in a position to buy the not knockoff.
Yeah.
So trust us, a rich person bought this the first time.
And a cast off
Right.
is valuable if it's a fancy cast off. A knockoff cast off is just garbage at that juncture, you know?
Yeah, the difference between a thrift shop and a consignment store.
So anywho, so in terms of looking at words, I mean, so I do have this preliminary write-up in terms of what do the tiers tell us, right? And some of the tiers, like, you know, the middle one, as you point out, there's lots of mental health trauma, but then when you weight them, it bounces up to things like finding object boundaries, right?
Yeah.
So unweighted, we're talking about coping strategies for mental health. Weighted, we're talking about tracing object boundaries and describing 30-second television clips. It's interesting, right? For the middle. Anywho, so and the Tf-Idf, which we hadn't really looked at before in terms of the tiers. We'd looked at Tf-Idf in just the raw frequency stuff, but we were primarily focusing on keyness for the tiers. If you fold in this Tf-Idf, there are some things that manifest there, like secondhand, that really don't appear in keyness measurements. And again, it's not like keyness or Tf-Idf, one's better than the other. They're just different weighting algorithms. They're different ways to say what's relevant in this mass of data, you know. So I can, you know, post these sort of scrappy notes that I have here, but it does give us a gestalt about sort of, you know, what's going on in each tier. And in doing this, it pointed towards some words that it might be interesting here to drill down into, which we haven't done yet. We were doing this in order to find these key terms that may be relevant. Let me see, did I? Yeah, because what's interesting is the more you look at this data, there are these same things that kind of keep coming up, you know. It's like the same kind of jobs keep kind of coming up.
Yeah.
And looking at these terms also, you know, I've talked about transcribing versus summarizing. In looking at this, describe or describing might fit in here too. I'm not sure if this is going to be a meaningful pair or not, but describe or description, even rewrite, you know, transcribing versus or extracting. This should be in here too. Because transcribe and extract showed up, it seems like, quite a bit together. Because like you're either, if you got a receipt, you're either extracting data from it or you're transcribing what's on it.
Yeah.
You're transcribing an audio clip or a video clip. One of the tiers actually talked about transcribing video, but you're transcribing. You're not describing it or summarizing it. That's a different.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah.
You know, I'm just converting data streams, really. But that's different than I'm going to give you an image and I want you to describe what you're seeing, right? So this has always been seemingly, it was sort of this intuitive break of it's a different cognitive task to transcribe what you're hearing versus to summarize or to describe an image, right? I mean, that's not data shifting. It's not format shifting. I don't know, because I haven't done the work yet, whether that is actually going to be an illuminating difference. Because we were talking about, you know, intuitive, it seems like those are cognitively different tasks. For compensation, I don't know if those are really
right. Oh, sorry.
That's you.
Okay, I'm back.
Then other things popped up, like all of this plexus of mental health. I mean, I guess that's the aegis, is mental health issues, coping, cancer, vet, Hurricane Harvey, which was so very prominent. But if you look at that, they're asking you to take a survey and reflect on your experiences. That comes up a lot too with these, is relive past experience.
Shit.
Somebody really wants to talk to you.
I know. Well, they can wait.
You know, in the bigrams and trigrams, you really start to see like relive past event, you know. So those bigrams and trigrams about reliving past events, and that often co-occurs with mental health kind of concern. I mean, that's why you're doing it, is, you know, to recollect this event. And it speaks to that thing we saw about, you know, Mechanical Turk asked me to relive the worst day of my life, and I got 50 cents for it. If you remember that one.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's this broader plexus of bad stuff, trauma, bad stuff, and talking about it. Market research surveys popped up quite a bit in a lot of ways. Ooh, this has a word, boundaries, is a really interesting word, because a lot of times it has to do with machine learning stuff, but it also has this kind of more sophisticated, you know, describing the level of damage, right? But the word boundary itself, I mean, is that purely being used in a image boundary way? How, you know, this might be interesting to drill into. What co-occurs with boundaries, you know? And then things we've talked about already, like opinion. Opinion seems to be a human-y word. Mood and sentiment seem to be human-y words. Rewriting seems human-y. Feelings, emotions, brand, product, secondhand. I mean, you know, these are just things I was jotting down as I was doing this.
Yeah.
This systematic examination of tiers. All right, well, that's the gist of what I've got. Oh yeah, it's been like an hour.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are then, I think, ways in to kind of parse out some of the distinctions here. And I think, I mean, what I find, at least, I can't think of the word now, validating, is that there's some interesting tensions in some of these categories.
Yeah.
Right. That depending on how we weight them or not, we get something that looks, you know, coping, mental health, but that's at the same tier as, you know, boundary objects and things like that. So there's some interesting mixing of categories that are happening.
Yeah. Yeah. In compensation, yeah, as we see, you know, the high and the low. I mean, what's happening there? But and in some sense, like, you know, you do see some things you expect, like the mood and sentiment stuff is the high compensation tier. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And partially, you know, part of me is like, in a sense, kind of troubled by that. But part of me is also like, well, then at least what we're doing works in at least some way, right? It's like, this is what I expected to see, and here's what I saw, and I'm not surprised by the results. So it's sort of like, oh, okay. Part of you was worried that it's like, well, I grabbed a hammer, so here's my nail. But then it's also like, but at least it's working, because, you know, I'd expect to see mood and sentiment to be the high compensation tier. Sure enough, it is, you know.
Yeah. Right. It's one of those where, like, yeah, I want to be surprised, but it's also like, but I'm glad to know that I did in fact bring the right tool. Yeah.
There is a thing of, you want to be surprised, you don't want to be baffled. It doesn't want to be completely random.
Right.
You want to be surprised by patterns, you know. It's sort of, you know, Janice Lauer's kind of, you know, heuristic sort of thing. It's like, yeah, there's randomness, but it's not aleatory.
Right.
I want to be surprised by a pattern, not surprised by it being utterly incomprehensible randomness.
Yeah, right. It's right. If you have a hammer, everything's a nail, but that's better than we showed up with a hammer and we just found a bunch of screws we can't do anything with, right? That would be worse.
Or I showed up and I found some nails, some carrots, the concept of ennui, glue. I mean, it's like, I don't know what to do with this, you know?
Right.
Anyway, so the next step then is to do the word level stuff, right? I mean, and
Yeah.
you've got some words there. I don't know precisely what I'm going to do in terms of processes. There's pairwise correlate. I mean, there's lots of ways basically to take words and then kind of figure out what co-occurs with those words, or how close are certain words together. I mean, that's one thing like word embeddings can do, is you get numerical scores of like how close numerically is this word to this word or that word. And the way that that functions is actually kind of interesting. I mean, one way to do it is if you think of words as existing on a 2D graph. So like it's got an X and a Y up here, and then this word has an X and a Y down here, then you can get, the distance between them, right? I mean, you can get a tangent or, whatever. And so it's doing that essentially, because essentially the way this works is it starts with terms in a higher dimensionality than just 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. And there are mathematical ways to, at higher dimensions, to knock that down to a 2-dimensional space. And then you can get a mathematical computation of here's how far apart those are. It's so, I mean, the method is actually really kind of interesting the way they do this, because as far as I understand it, you're dealing in dimensions that we don't have access to as 3-dimensional beings, and yet those dimensions are there and convenient, because we can then knock them down to lower dimensionality so that we can compare them. It's fascinating stuff. I don't have a complete handle on. I can do it, but I'm a little adrift with the sort of numerical theory behind the mathematics behind it. This is a frequency co-occurrence matrix, I believe. So there's just a lot of ways to kind of get different notions of what words go together. And, if you're talking about mood, what else are you talking about? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's the next step. And that means I'm just going to have to jump back into the cockpit. Every time we go away from this, then I come back. It's like when I have to do our stuff again, there's always a few, at least a little bit of, oh crap, what was I doing? I mean, once you go away from it and come back, it's like, what was I doing? How do I do this again?
Right. Yeah.
All my notes are just sort of scribbles to myself about, code to enter. And I'm like, I get back on the horse, but it always takes a little bit to get back into the saddle again there.
Well, and that's why I'm looking forward in the next couple of weeks, whenever this semester finally ends.
You're still teaching?
What?
You're still teaching?
No, it's just finishing up all the administrative stuff, which is at this point, I fear, already spilling into getting ready. We have just learned that we're probably the university is going to start us back a week earlier than we were going to start
in the fall.
Yeah.
Why? Just to try and why?
I mean, I think to get students on campus before they have to leave campus again.
Well, see, that's like, I saw some universities are starting early and ending early to try and, hit a window.
I think that's what this is.
But it seems like a week wouldn't, I mean, I actually, because where I am is, Hurricane Central, well before the coronavirus, I was like, we need to shift our academic year, because without fail, it's right in the heart of hurricane season. We need to either be going earlier in the summer and then ending sooner, or later after the hurricane season has ended, because every year we have to close school because we're hammered by a hurricane, and it's only
given where you're at, your school year should not be organized around the harvesting season. It should be organized around hurricane
season. Yeah. And now there may be a little more, I was always like, this is never going to, it's one of those things that's like, but you cannot change the academic year. Maybe now you can.
I mean, apparently so, which is funny, because they originally
opportunity in this.
They tried to do this six months ago, because they were trying to squeeze in an intersession in the winter. And all the faculty complained because it actually created contract issues. Now they're getting to do it anyway because of the virus, and there's going to be no momentum to push back on it this time, because we just won this fight, and now we lost it again.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting, because these kind of things, they expose, I don't think it's quite as easy as saying like, well, clearly then that was nothing. It was not a big deal. You could have done it anytime. I mean, I see a lot of sort of
Yeah,
write-ups about, and some of them, I'm sympathetic to, like, well, then we could have all been working from home because we're doing it now, or we could have all had universal basic income because de facto we have it now, or health insurance that could have existed. And
yeah,
yet, as you point out, there are often, and you find this when you're an administrator, things that seem like just stupid arbitrary decisions. There's all these weird constituencies that you haven't considered until you get in a position where you have to do it. It's like,
yeah,
I know this seems like an easy fix, but here's why we've been doing it this way for 20 years and why it's very tough to change, to get out of that groove,
yeah.
because of things like, well, there are contract issues that are intractable. And then
Right.
there are things you have to consider, like that means you're going to have to keep your janitorial staff because now the building is open at different times. It's
Yeah.
like there are all these things you don't consider until you have to.
Oh, no, every time we try to move something, 6 other things have to get.
They break. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I just saw something the other day about the dangers of returning to your office because no one's been in it. And there's like a real chance of things like Legionnaire's disease because of standing water. I mean, it's probably not something to get too worked up about, but I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I mean, you don't want to be around standing water for particular reasons.
Yeah. Ugh. Well, I look forward to Legionnaire's disease.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got, which is funny because I imagine a bunch of us just have gout at this point.
I'm worried about vitamin D deficiency. I mean, I literally don't go outside for days at a time.
Yeah,
It's been raining here for a week, and so we can't go outside. And I'm like, I'm worried about this.
yeah. Okay, well,
Yep. The upside is we're moving along with the research. So
yeah, it's something.
if you can also, I'll post those things, but if you can take a look at, the keenness stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
the stage we're at now is finding interesting terms. That's the stage we're at now.
yeah,
If you look at the keenness and the Tf-Idf, maybe you'd want to look at the stuff I found. Maybe you don't want to look at that because it'll color your perception of it. Even frequency stuff. It's just I want a bank of interesting terms because we're kind of moving in this zoom from the whole thing through frequency, categories through compensation levels, and then keenness, and I mean that's how we're looking at it, keenness and Tf-Idf, and then zooming way down into like the word level.
yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And there's a few of the ones that you've listed that I've got some scattered notes I just need to collect.
Okay. Yeah, and most of that can just go on that preliminary findings document.
Yeah.
Shared thing. All right, we got anything else?
No, that's all I got.
All right, so that's what we'll do, and then we'll talk again in a fortnight.
Oh, by the way, I sent you an image of this, but I tweeted out about our project, and apparently, someone was doing a word search, and I've now been followed by Turkerview, a firm that builds tools for MTurk.
No, our B pool brings in Turkerview.
Oh, cool.
And in fact, I think they may produce the because there's a Chrome plugin that there's a lot of them that do things like help Turkers manage jobs. And so in our workflow depended on, I think it's Turkerview, a plugin that I was using for the B pool to collect all those jobs together and then get information about them readily.
It's using data shared by some of the most experienced workers on MTurk. Users can gain insights into hits that pay well and are safe to work on.
Yeah, in fact, if you
That's interesting that I was surprised to see I pay well made sense, but safe to work on was an interesting pair that I don't know, that safety emerged as a concern. There was it brings me back to all the IRB discussions that we had.
Well, and I just sent you that thing. Let me see, because I still have it pulled up in Signal. Let's see.
Oh yeah, the abuse.
Yeah, that there was just a well, heck, where did I put that? There was that finding about.
Oh yeah, with the Facebook and its content moderators.
Yep, there was just a judgment about like money for PTSD.
$52 million for trauma from gore and sexual abuse.
Yeah, now I can't find where I sent it to you, but
It's in Signal. It's up just a bit. You sent it Wednesday.
yeah, I don't think Signal's showing everything. Well, anyway, all right. Well, grist for the mill. All right. Well, I will see you in a couple of weeks.
All right. Bye.
Yeah.